Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Jesse Nealand, and today we're going to talk about the fantasy of the thin ideal. So first of all, let's define the thin ideal. What does that mean? The thin ideal is specifically for women, although, this can apply to all genders in some capacity in our culture. But specifically for women, the idea that the ideal body is very slender, very small, very low body fat, really thin in curves in the right places and all of those things. It's the beauty ideal for women. And it is a very thin body, almost exclusively is the sort of social ideal that we hold. And even if you don't hold that, you know that other people hold that there is a thin ideal in our society that is sort of generally held. Now, the fantasy of the thin ideal is what people hold in their own minds of what would happen for them if they met that ideal. So this can be, if you imagine your life when you finally lose the weight you want to lose, that might be your thin ideal. If it's totally different than your life now, or if you feel completely different in this fantasy, you probably have some kind of fantasy around the thin ideal. This can look a lot of different ways because you could maybe imagine that if you were thinner and closer to this ideal body, you would get a partner or be having amazing sex or have more friends or do better at work. And some things in this space can actually be based in reality, but most of it is not. So there is for sure discrimination against people in large bodies. Fat phobia and the anti-fat bias are a very real thing. But for a lot of people who are holding this fantasy, it is just that. It is just a fantasy. If they lose the weight, they are actually not going to feel more confident and better. If they reach their body goal and they look like this ideal, which isn't even possible or sustainable for most people, but if they did, odds are pretty good their life is going to look very similar. They're not suddenly going to have this glamorous, fun, fulfilling life. Like, they're still going to be them, just in a thinner body. But that's not what we usually picture when there are goals involved for looking different. We usually picture a happier life, a more fulfilled life, a more satisfying life, or a life full of things that we're getting our needs met and fun people and adventure and whatever. So that is the fantasy. And it's really important to know what your fantasy is. Maybe you don't have a thin ideal. Maybe you have a pretty ideal or a muscular ideal or whatever your ideal is. What is the fantasy attached to it? Because if you really want to look different and you're struggling with how you look now, odds are pretty good what you actually want is the fantasy. Not so much the body. If you could have that life that you imagine you would have if you looked different today, would you still want to look different? Probably not. That's a huge part of a lot of people's body dissatisfaction. Is dissatisfaction with the aspects of their life that they ascribe to how they look or how they are failing to meet this thin ideal. So pay attention if this is a part of your story, your journey, because knowing what your ideal is specifically can be helpful, but even more helpful is knowing what your fantasy of what that means is. What does it mean to you? What do you imagine would be different in your life? How would you feel different than you do today if you suddenly met this thin ideal? Now, even if that's not possible for you, you can learn a lot about your body image issues just by exploring that question. What is your fantasy of how you would feel and what life would be like if you looked how you want to look? That's going to give you a lot of information about the kind of life you want to live now and the way you want to feel now that you can totally start moving towards without changing the way you look at all. So if you want an adventurous life, you can start adventuring in the exact body you have today. If you want a life full of more connection with people or more, sensual experiences with sexual partners, you can start doing those things in the body you have today. Whatever it is in your fantasy is going to give you information for how to actually get what you want without changing how you look, which is incredibly helpful as you're trying to heal body image issues and move towards body neutrality. I hope that was helpful. If so, I would love if you would hit like and subscribe, and I will see you next week.